We're at 6 p.m., so I think we're going to get started and have some time at the beginning to have a little bit of education and fun before we launch in, and also give more people an opportunity to join us in these first few minutes. So first, I'm just going to remind people that we are only having presenters with their video on. And at this point in time, participants can submit questions through the chat box. And there is an icon that has the chat box. And when you type in a question, or maybe just a thought, or maybe you just want to share a message with a panelist, you're welcome to do so. And that message will just go to me. So not everybody will see it, but please do submit your questions throughout. And we'll have time, trying to reserve time at the end for a Q&A. Also note that this meeting is being recorded. And so thank you for understanding that. And we should have the recording available about a week after this event, and we'll be putting that up and accessed definitely through the League of Women Voters website. We'll have a link to it, and there may be other locations through us and our partners as well. So first, I'm going to get us going with a little quiz. Today, August 18th, is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And we're going to be delving into that quite a bit more today. And so I wanted to start off with just some education, some context for us all, and through polls and questions. So I'm going to start with the first one here. Please, even if you don't know the answer, just take a guess. It's all anonymous. And we'll just take about 10 seconds for each one. So in August 18th, today, 100 years ago, what state became the 36th state, cementing the 19th Amendment? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And looks like the majority here, 53%, did get Tennessee. So Tennessee was that 36th state. And I think just about a week ago, NPR did a great oral history of that day, that momentous day, when a freshman delegate to the House of Representatives, Harry T. Byrne, who was 24 years old, came in. It was a huge issue of whether Tennessee was going to go one way or the other. And one of the ways that you could mark that was by wearing a white or a red rose in your lapel as a legislator. And he walked in with a red rose on his lapel, meaning that he was anti-suffrage. And through the course of the day, they came to different votes, and it came to a tie, 48-48. And then he was called, and he flipped his vote for women's suffrage. And pandemonium broke out. I think he had to crawl through a window to get away from people that were trying to assault him. And the ratification was passed. In the end, what we know now, it was a nudge from his mother, Feb Byrne, that compelled the 24-year-old to make that indelible mark on women's voting in the US. And a couple of months later, in October of 1920, his mother was the first female registered to vote in her county for elections that year. So go Feb Byrne. And then I'm going to go to the next poll. How many American women belonged to suffrage groups before the passage of the amendment? About 5 more seconds. Okay. Oh, you guys really got these ones right. So more than 1 million women were engaged in many different groups. There were some really large ones and very similar names across them. The American Women's Suffrage Association, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the National Women's Suffrage Association. I mean, it's hard to keep all of these in mind, but quite a huge movement that had been building and part of the suffrage movement. Okay, so the third question. This act was critical in continuing to expand voter rights after 1920. Take about 10 seconds. We have the Voting Rights Act, the 24th Amendment, Immigration and Nationality Act, and the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay. I'm going to end polling. And right again, really every single one of those was instrumental in making sure that we are able to move forward with voting rights for all. And we have another question about the voting rights. What was the Voting Rights Act of 1965? What was the reason that it was passed? Give about 5 more seconds. Okay. And this one as well. It was to enforce the 15th and the 19th Amendments. Or it upheld the 15th and 19th. The 15th Amendment granted Black men the right to vote. And although that was passed in 1870, it took nearly 100 years before it actually took effect through the Voting Rights Act because of so many different means of voter suppression and intimidation that happened with Black men voting in our country. So the fifth question, just thinking about voter suppression, we were just talking about. Historically, what efforts were included to dismantle the rights of voters? Okay, and I'm gonna end polling here. And yes, every single one of these was tactics that were used for keeping people from the polls. So let's look at today. In 2020, voter suppression initiatives. These are, well, I might be giving away an answer there, I was gonna say. These are not all of them. Take that as a freebie. Okay, I'm gonna end polling. And in just about every issue identified as a common barrier to voting. In almost every single one of these, when polled in survey after survey, Black and Hispanic respondents were twice as likely or more to have experienced those barriers as white respondents. 15% of Black respondents and 14% of Hispanic respondents in a nationwide poll last year said that they had trouble finding polling places on election day versus 5% of white people. Roughly 1 in 10 Hispanic people said that the last time they or someone in their household tried to vote, they were bothered at the polls. This is in our era right now. And it may not be a surprise to you, but it is why we're here today, why we're educating, why we're understanding our history and how we can impact equity and voting for all going forward. Going back to 1869, what state was the first to grant voting rights to women? Okay, a couple more seconds. And Wyoming. Wyoming was a US territory in 1869. And it was Wyoming's first territorial legislature voted to give women the right to vote and to hold public office. That legislature was made up entirely of men who passed the women's suffrage bill in 1869. And I think we have one more here as people are coming in. Have you asked women in your family about their voting story or stories. This is also why we're here today. We have to carry these stories forward, to understand our past, to know our families' stories. I invite you, if you haven't yet, and you have elders in your family, in your friend circle, extended family, to talk to them. Know what was their first experience voting like? What did they encounter? That's the way that we can learn from our past and move forward. So I see that we are up to 73 people in here. So welcome. Thank you everybody for attending. And I'm going to move forward here. My name is Jessica McDonald, and I have the distinct pleasure of being able to speak with all of you participants, and especially our panelists here tonight. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters. And before we take a moment to talk a little bit about who the League is at the front end, I want to take a moment to reflect on where we're all sitting here today. From my desk, which overlooks the Willamette River in downtown Corvallis, I'm standing on the ancestral homelands of the Kalapuya, who have thrived and lived on and stewarded this land since time immemorial. I honor the Kalapuya and commit to reparations for indigenous land loss. I invite you, wherever you're calling from, this is one of the benefits of having Zoom. I know we have people from out of the state here. I invite you to learn more about land loss and stolen lands in your area, where you reside, where your home is. At the League of Women Voters, this year we are celebrating our 100th anniversary. It's no coincidence that it happens to be on the same 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The League of Women Voters came out, completely out of the suffrage movement. We advocate for a more perfect democracy where every person has the desire, the right, and the knowledge to participate fully. Today we are here on the same day that, maybe even within a few hours, that 100 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified, saying that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by any state on account of sex. The 19th Amendment is a cornerstone of gender equality in our country, yet many of us know so little about the way that the right to vote was won. As the organization that was formed completely out of the suffrage movement, the League of Women Voters is inextricably tied to this history. So as we celebrate 100 years, we also honor the struggle and stories of women and men who worked tirelessly over generations to secure this right. And we know that this is only part of the story. I don't know about you, but my history books on women's suffrage were filled with white women leaders, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who effectively, through that single narrative, effectively silenced multitudes of leaders who led suffrage movements, but were not honored or in the storybooks because of the color of their skin. This singular narrative leaves out the reality also that for so many in our country, they would not see the right to vote for decades after the passage of the 19th Amendment. Every one of us, by learning and sharing this expanded truth of the suffrage movement, offers what I would consider a vital public service by debunking this pernicious falsehood about the 19th Amendment, that it concluded a century-long battle for equality by guaranteeing women the right to vote. This is the complicated truth, that while millions of American women had won voting rights before at the 19th Amendment ratification, millions more would be shut out of the polls after that ratification for decades. As Ida B. Wells said, "The way to right the wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." I think that is, as the League of Women Voters, as each one of us here today, is our responsibility. Today we celebrate and share the stories of suffrage leaders. We expose the shameful parts of white supremacy deeply embedded in the movement and consider the ongoing challenges we face today of voter suppression. These are the heroes of our suffrage story. Black women, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, people like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, an African American poet and writer for women's rights, like Coralie Franklin Cook, a leader in the African American communities of Washington, D.C., who became disillusioned by the women's suffrage movement, saying it had turned its back on the women of color. Mabel Ping Kwa Lee, who by age 16 was leading the New York City suffrage movement and mobilized Chinese communities to support the suffrage. Ida B. Wells, the prominent journalist, activist, who also exposed white mob violence in newspapers across the South. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, an African-American publisher, journalist, and civil rights leader, who also published the first national newspaper by and for African-American women. Sakala Sa, Yankton Dakota Sioux writer and activist who lectured nationwide to promote the cultural and tribal identity of Native Americans and the movement to unite all American tribes in the cause for lobbying for citizens' rights. Mary Ann Shadd Carey, who was the first Black woman publisher in North America and the first women publisher in Canada, whose newspapers worked to uplift the race, change the perspective of white Americans and what they held about former slaves. She also became the first African-American woman to vote in a national election. Sarah Winnemucca, Paiute tribe who spent much of her life here in Oregon, in southeastern Oregon, on the Malheur Reservation. She was a translator and an emissary and lobbied for self-government and land rights for her people. Fannie Barrier Williams, who was involved in social and educational reforms. She ended up being the only African-American selected to eulogize Susan B. Anthony. Sofia Reyes de Vera, while advocating for Philippine independence and living in Washington, D.C., Sofia and other Filipinas joined local women's rights organizations that supported the suffrage movement. And then she went back to the Philippines and helped form women's clubs that eventually won the women's right to vote in 1937 there. Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa tribe became a nationally recognized spokesperson for indigenous women's rights and suffrage. Sojourner Truth, an outspoken advocate for abolition, temperance, and civil and women's rights in the 19th century. She challenged prevailing notions of racial and gender inferiority and inequality by reminding listeners of her combined strength and female status. Anna Julia Cooper, visionary Black feminist leader, who you should read her foundational text of Black feminist thought, A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South, which argued for the central place of Black women in the battle for equal and civil rights. Laura Cornelius Kellogg, an Oneida leader, fought for communal tribal lands, tribal autonomy, and self-government. Delta Sigma Theta, and I think Angel might reference them, 22 young Black women who marched in the suffrage parade in New York in 1913. Elizabeth Wanamaker Peratrovich, who was a Tlingit native and was instrumental in passing the Anti-Discrimination Act of 1945. Her 1945 speech was highly credited as the reason the bill passed. Fannie Lou Hamer was an African-American voting and women's rights activist, community organizer, leader in the civil rights movement. In 1962, she was 42 years old, told something at a meeting that she had never heard before, that Black people had the right to vote. She decided to register on the spot. Then later, about a week later, she boarded a bus to head to Indianola with 17 other people to register to vote. That day, not only was she kicked off the bus, she was arrested and beaten. She was left from her job, and her husband lost his job, a place they had worked at for almost 20 years. All for the simple and powerful act of registering to vote. So we are here, each of us, you and I, every one of us, because of the sacrifices and the leadership and the struggle that these women led in our country. And today, as we celebrate 100 years of the 19th Amendment, we celebrate you, your families, and these heroes. I am so delighted to welcome you to our three panelists this evening. Angel Harris wears many hats. I see her everywhere I go. She is a mother, a wife, a nurse. She is the president of the Corvallis-Albany chapter of the NAACP. Dr. Luhui Whitebear is a scholar and activist. She is the assistant director of Oregon State University's Native American Longhouse, and I just read her article recently published by University of Washington on disrupting systems of oppression by recentering indigenous feminisms. Sujittra Avery Carr is an OSU graduate in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Avery collaborated with OSU Library Special Collections and Archives Research to create Beyond Suffrage, Giving Voice to Oregon's Unsung Women. And I believe that will be going up in the library and available for people to view. Maybe Avery, if you can mention how people can view that this fall. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Nice to see you all. And a reminder that if you have a question, please put it into the chat. I will see that, and we will make sure that it is noted. And if we have time, we'll be able to ask the panelists questions at the end. So welcome. I guess it would be good to start by knowing a bit more about you. Take a few minutes to tell us why this history, why this reckoning with our history around the suffrage movement is important to you. What is your connection to this? Luhui, would you mind going first?
Sure. Okay, everyone. Thanks for being here. And again, my name is Luhui Whitebear. I use she pronouns. And for me, when I'm thinking about reckoning with the history of voting rights, it's important because oftentimes people don't understand how recent it has been that people of color have been able to have the right to vote. Before that, we didn't have that right. And understanding that the political decisions that impacted our lives were made without our consent. And that's critical to understand, and understanding voting rights and where we are as a nation. If you think about the history of indigenous peoples with the United States, it started with a lot of genocide, as hopefully you're aware of. If not, please learn. And knowing that we weren't even citizens of the United States until 1924. As the first peoples of these lands, we weren't considered citizens of a nation that came over and was established with our destruction in mind. And it was built on top of the existing nations, on top of the political systems that were already in place. And thinking about specifically how the Declaration of Independence holds those words in it that described us as merciless Indian savages. as subhuman. We weren't viewed as equals then, or even fully human for that matter. And to me, that's really important to understand and know that all of these decisions were being made through policy, federal law, through state laws that ended up with land theft. Things such as the Morrill Act, which created land grant institutions, which one of them I work for, understanding that that was stolen land to establish state institutions without tribes having any say in those. And I'm still like processing all the pictures that you showed, Jessica. And that actually made me really emotional, seeing how beautiful that history is and how powerful those women were. And thinking, I'll talk a little bit later about some of them in particular, but thinking about how they were fighting for something that wasn't even for them. At the time, they knew that the right to vote was centered on white women's right to vote. That wasn't a secret at all. And so whether or not we like or agree with the systems in which we live, we're still impacted by those systems. And understanding the histories of how they were made, the decisions that are made, is really important to understand. And so for me, understanding that history of voting rights made me want to vote even more, because for so long, Indigenous people, especially women, were stripped of their political autonomy in this nation. And now we have the opportunity to create change, political change, and a lot of that has to do with being able to vote. And like I said, whether or not we like it or agree with the systems, that's who we live with right now. And to be able to make this place a little bit more livable for everyone, that's where the necessity of understanding the history of why it's important to vote is important to me. And I'll pause there and be back in a bit.
Yeah. Fighting for something that wasn't even for them is really powerful. And also thinking about, it makes me think about the multi-generational aspect of this as well. Angel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. Thank you, Luhui, for starting us off, because those pictures really got to me. It was actually the first time in my 43 years of life that I got to hear a full, like that we're included, right? That women of color are included in the story of our country. And so it's pretty powerful. And I was actually thinking, I wish that my kids were sitting here with me. And so I will definitely be letting them watch this video, just so they can understand that, especially my daughter, that she is a part of this country's history as well. So thank you for that, first of all. And secondly, I wanted to kind of touch bases on personally what this day means to me, what women's suffrage means to me. I am a Black woman. I was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1976 and moved to Oregon in 1990, in the summer of 90. And so I get the experiences of both states. And so with that comes some really personal ties to voting, or maybe therefore the lack of the rights of voting for my family members. And so I kind of wanted to share, just really touch on a couple of personal ties with the women's suffrage movement. And I want to do that now. And so the first thing I want to share, and we've talked about her already a little bit, was Ida B. Wells. And, you know, Harriet Tubman, like she's one of the people that I really look up to, because no matter what, she made a way, right? And it wasn't just for her, but it was for her people, all her people, right? And so, but Ida B. Wells, another Black woman who didn't just stand up for herself, but stood up for other women. And I feel like she stood up for me, even though she didn't know me, right? And she was also a woman that was born in Mississippi, the state of Mississippi. So I take that personally. And she was born in 1862, y'all, 1862. And when you research Ida B. Wells Barnett, you will wonder how in the world did she do so much back then, with the walls that were always put in her way. But as a journalist, you couldn't stop her. When it came to talking about anti-lynching, you couldn't stop her. And when it came to women's rights, even though she didn't get the right, she fought, and you couldn't tell her nothing. And so one of the things Ida B. Wells did was she just didn't talk about stuff, she did some stuff, right? And she started some organizations. One of them, I'm the NAACP president, and one of them was she co-founded the NAACP in 1909. She was one of two women, you guys, in 1909 that co-founded the NAACP. And then she also, not only did that, she co-founded several women organizations, because as you know, we weren't able to, as Black women and women of color, to be a part of white women organizations and clubs, right? And so one of the major ones that she found, which is still around today, is the National Association of Colored Women. She helped co-found that organization. But if you look, she co-founded several different clubs and organizations, and she also, which we'll get to later, is a part of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, which I also pledged at Oregon State University in December of 1996. So Ida B. Wells has a special, special place in my heart. And then we have, again, I want to talk about Delta Sigma Theta, because as you guys research, and I want you guys to really research the history, they're left out a lot. And we have some resources where we share an article about the historic Black sorority, Delta Sigma Theta. And why is it so important to mention them? Because that was our first act, or should I say that was our first act of service, because we were founded as a service organization. As a sorority, we just didn't want to party. We wanted to actually reach out to our community. And so in 1913, January of 1913, these 22 college women founded Delta Sigma Theta, and their first act of service was in March of 1913, and they marched, you guys, in the women's suffrage parade, which, as you probably all know, they were told to go to the back because the white women did not want them to, first of all, march in the parade at all. But if they were going to be in the parade, and if they were going to be allowed to be in it, they would have to be separate, and they would need to be in the back. Can you imagine? And so these bold, courageous college women at Howard University set out to be a part of that women's suffrage march. And Ida B. Wells, of course, was in that march. And Ida B. Wells, because you couldn't tell her nothing, she didn't want to march in the back, y'all. So guess what Ida B. Wells did? She found her way with her Illinois constituents. She found her way to march with them, even though they told her not to do that. And so again, that's very personal for me as a Delta, as a Black woman who's told you can't do that. And so I remember they did it so that I couldn't do it, right? And then lastly, but not least, is the other personal tie for me is Mississippi. I told you I was born in Mississippi, and what does Mississippi have to do with the 19th Amendment? So as we learned earlier, there had to be at least 36 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Mississippi was one of the states that did not vote to ratify the 19th Amendment. And Jessica, I should have had you have this question, have this as a polling question, but what year did Mississippi ratify the 19th Amendment? 1970? No. 1975? Because remember, 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, right? By those 36 states. Mississippi, 1980? Has it been ratified in 1980? No. 1982, it's got to be, okay, 1982, 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. No. 1983, no. it wasn't until March of 1984 that my dear Mississippi decided it was now good for us to acknowledge that women should have the right to vote. And so they decided to finally ratify. And yes, my dear state of Mississippi was the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And so when someone asks me if I'm gonna vote, y'all, you shouldn't even ask me if I'm gonna vote. I don't have a choice but to vote because of all the people who fought for me to vote and who stood up so that I can vote, even in the midst of the fact that they couldn't even vote, and a lot of them died without that privilege. Yeah, I don't get a choice to vote. So that's where I'll stop at right now. And thank you.
Thank you, Angel. The responsibility of us to carry through. They did it so we can. They did that. They struggled so we can be here today. Yeah. Avery, welcome. Thank you for being here. And we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful and excited to be part of this. I think it's really, really important. So just again, my name is Sujittra Avery Carr, and I use both my middle name and my first name. And I like to I use them in different spaces, and I like to use them both because I think it's really important. I'm multiracial, and I like both my names, and I like having them sort of interchanged. And to that point, I also use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I think the plurality of that is really important, to not have to fit in a box, because I don't fit in a box. And that's something that's very, very important. And my connection with this, I have grown up in Portland, Oregon. That's kind of where I've spent my whole life. And it's quite a white place to be raised. There's been a lot of sort of like what's mentioned, a lot of what I learned about the suffrage movement was based on white women. I remember the children's sort of picture books where you've got the drawings of the women primarily focused around sort of DC and some of the demonstrations and some of the picketing and all of that. And that was my experience. And then I got the lovely opportunity to have an internship with the OSU archives and work with Natalia Fernandez and Tia, who are just lovely, lovely women, and look for a project that sort of recognizes the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And as I was doing this, it was wonderful. I was gifted so much responsibility and creativity with this, and it was amazing. And as I started to do research, I really learned that we talk about suffrage movement and women's suffrage as though it's over, as though it's something that happened, that it's part of history. And we kind of truncate it. Like, it happened, it was ratified, good, we're good to go. And we can sometimes talk about the sort of additional acts and amendments that have been made that have granted other groups right to vote or made it easier for people to have the right to vote. But the language around what we say often puts it in this place of history. And it is and it isn't. It's very continued active work that people behind the scenes have been doing for decades and generations. And it's not just the work of the women who got the 19th Amendment ratified, who got various consecutive acts acknowledged. It's not just their work that has allowed us to be here. It is continued steady work from that point that has stretched into now. We are continuing. It never stopped. And for me, that was one of the really important things about sort of acknowledging this day, acknowledging it in the project, which will be available in a PDF form, I believe, sort of at the end of this month or possibly early next month. So check that out on the Special Archives and Collections website. It's probably going to be a blog post, so check that out. I'll remind you all later. But I think it's really important to know that this is continued activism. It never stopped. It's never paused. And there isn't time to pause. We can't think of it as though it's over or done with. We need to keep engaging because, as Angel said, you know, Mississippi didn't ratify this until really recently. And just that mindset, even though technically you can say people have the right to do this, technically, sure, but that doesn't translate to practically. And it's really important that we understand that just because something is written down in law doesn't mean it actually is enacted properly, doesn't mean that there aren't barriers, and doesn't mean that the work has stopped. And so that's my connection to this, is that I like history, I like archives, I kind of sort of focused on this, but I just graduated. I am friends with wonderful activists, and there's a lot of focus in my world as a young college student doing this sort of work. And my friends are the ones who are doing this sort of work. We are the college students who are organizing and trying to push and change. And, you know, learning about it, reading about it, hearing about it, you realize that it's not something that your ancestors just sort of did once and now you're here. It's something that we have all done and all need to continue to do. And so that's why I'm here. And then additionally, there's a history of Asian American invisibility. And as an Asian American person, I often find that, especially in Oregon, in classes, there is an invisibleness to the work. There is an invisibleness to the activism that the Asian American community has been doing for a long time, and especially the Asian women. There are stereotypes around how quiet Asian women can be, that they are sort of behind the scenes. And in my research that I've done in the movements and all of the suffrage work that has happened in Oregon, because that's what I focused on, you know, there were lots of Asian American women that just never were mentioned. It was invisible, really hard work, and they were bold. And the stereotype of Asian American women is not one of being bold. You get other members of other racial groups who are categorized as bold, and they're seen as bold, especially Black women. They're always called out for being too loud, too bold. And there are other groups who are, no matter how loud they are, called quiet. And I think we need to understand that both groups, all groups, occupy all of the space of loudness and quietness. And some really need to be focused on more than others. You know, in America, we really do need to focus on our Native and Indigenous people. We really need to focus and acknowledge the history of slavery and what our African Americans and Black Americans have gone through and what they continue to go through. And I want to be able to support that. And there's been a history of Asian American women who support that, and Asian American women too, who also contribute. They side with the white women, and they also participate in the racism. And I think it's just really important to acknowledge that that has happened. It continued to happen, and it is still happening. And that's what I would like to share with everyone.
Thank you, Avery. That was really powerful. And I am so many thoughts, but one of those going through my head right now is I'm so glad that people like you and this, I don't know, future generations are being so passionate about voting rights right now and recognizing the continuity of this suppression and that it is not over and that we're the marathon nature of this, multi-generational. Thank you so much. So panelists, I would offer you a question of, you know, as we look at the entrenched racism within the suffrage movement, what do you most want people to know? And I will open that for anybody that wants to go first. What do you want participants here to know most? I will add into that as you're considering. I know we've heard from Angel, her hero of Ida B. Wells Burnett. If you have a voting rights, somebody in your history that you really look up to I think we'd all love to hear that.
I'm happy to start answering that question. And I think one of the things I want people to know the most is that the suffrage movement was heavily inspired by Indigenous women's political autonomy. And that's often left out of the narrative completely because one, they weren't looked at as fully people, and two, they weren't considered citizens, like I said before. But Indigenous women have always been viewed as a threat to the systems in which we live because of that political autonomy. And so one of the women that I really look up to, and I actually wrote about in my dissertation, is Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who you had a slide of earlier. And as you already mentioned, was a member of the Oneida Nation. What a lot of people don't know about her is that she was also a founder of the Society of American Indians, which was the first national American Indians rights organization. And she was part of that group. She was also a teacher at Sherman Indian School, and she was a really powerful woman. She wrote a book called Our Democracy in the American Indian to talk about political autonomy of Indigenous nations based on their own ancestral governing systems and existing governing systems to exist on their own terms, and came up with a whole thing called the Lomi Plan, which I encourage you to learn more about. And she also worked really heavily with the suffrage movement. And one of my favorite quotes of hers in general is about the suffrage movement, and I'm going to quote her. And she said, "It is a cause of astonishment to us that you white women are only now, in this 20th century, claiming what has been the Indian woman's privilege as far back as history traces." And I like that quote because she's saying, we know this is your right, and we're going to help you with this. We want you to have political autonomy as well. We want you to be able to vote, even though, like we've been saying, that wasn't true for Indigenous women. And what she was doing is she was offering a framework of women's political autonomy based on her own Oneida systems, even though settler contexts didn't consider Oneida systems as legitimate. But one of the things too that's important to point out about her work, as well as the other Indigenous women, Black women, women of color, is that despite all of their involvement, it was the white women's work that made it look revolutionary in the eyes of society. Women in many nations already had those rights the suffrage movement asked for. So, and I think that we've done a good job of talking about how the suffrage movement was actually exclusive of women of color, specifically Black and Indigenous women, and learning and knowing that that is how it was passed, was saying, I will make sure that they're excluded, I think is important for people to know as well. And so I think about people like Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who worked so hard to help bring that right, and also understanding that they could leverage those relationships that they built with the women that were part of the suffrage movement to help advocate for Indigenous rights. And so when you showed some of the slides earlier, another person you brought up that I really look up to is Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins. And part of it has to do with being from like the West Coast area as well. And I feel like her story is really undertold as well. I think Laura Cornelius Kellogg's is one of the most undertold stories of Indigenous women's political work, but which is always surprising for how much she did. And Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins as well is leveraging those relationships to help advocate for her people. So she helped to negotiate treaties and lead her people in ways that were intimidating to a lot of women of that time, because she was able to be a translator and understand what was going on. She later went on what they called, I can't remember what they're called at the moment, but she did speaking tours. And a lot of people were calling Indigenous women princesses and romanticized them very heavily. But what she was doing during those speaking tours was actually helping spread the word that her people were imprisoned in Yakima. all the way from the Burns area. And she was advocating for her people to be freed and returned to the Burns Paiute Reservation. And there's a long history of why that happened, and a lot of it has to do with land theft and the selling of government rations that were given to the tribes at that time. But the point is that she was going on those speaking tours trying to raise awareness to help set them free. And so I really look up to her for that, for her ability to navigate within a system that wasn't made for her. It was really dangerous. She was among the indigenous women in the Nevada, California area that was first met the white settlers. And so I think about that time period of how scary that would have been to have somebody come over and like completely try to replace everything. And I see that with my California peoples as well, of how there's been these waves of violence that we've had to endure, and thinking about these strong women who wanted to be part of, not want to be part of a system, but wanted to share what they knew about governance and about having political autonomy with women that didn't have it. And so to know that the suffrage movement looked up to these women, they also romanticized people like Sacagawea as being like what it means to be a strong woman in a very romanticized way, but that's not how these women viewed themselves. And it doesn't represent the work they did either. They were doing very political work back then and continue to this day. So I'm really happy to see more Indigenous women being involved in politics. I've been involved with activism my entire life, and so it's kind of almost contradictory in some ways to be excited about people being involved in a system that you're actively resisting. But like I said earlier, it's to honor these women who made this possible for us to vote, and also for us to be able to have a voice that we haven't had before to help create changes to make this place more livable. And so that's what I would hope people know the most, is the inspiration behind the movement and understanding that Indigenous women have always had the rights to political autonomy. And I'm glad that they were able to use their leadership to help make that possible for other women in this country too.
The thing that is so incredible is the idea, so much of what you said, but the idea that the Iroquois and other nations were the inspiration for much of the suffrage movement, and yet it was also because of their matriarchal power that they were also a threat and seen as intimidating. And I just wrestling with that. Let Angel or Avery, either of you wanting to jump in next?
I can jump in. I think for me, on top of all of the really important points that are being brought up and will be brought up, one of the things that I think it's important to remember as a member of any society, and especially when talking about the history of political movements, is who is creating the history, why is the history being created, who is documenting it, what form is it being documented in, and where is the documentation happening, who's preserving it, all of these different pieces. Because when we look back and we're trying to understand what happened, who was involved, how did it feel, we sometimes forget that there's bias in how that was recorded, and that there is bias that creates invisibility. Some work was not seen as important enough to record, and we might never know whether or not it happened. When you think about women who you could find images of, you have to wonder, why do these images exist? Who took them? How influential were these women that they got to a space where these pictures could be taken? And there were so many women who, and others too, other people who identified other ways, who supported this work and did this work invisibly, like mothers who cajoled their kids into doing something different, who bugged their children into voting a different way. Women who would have been able to support daughters, mothers who could support daughters, daughters who could support mothers, everything that these women did, so much of it isn't actually documented. It's not recorded. It hasn't been passed down. A lot of who was documenting were men. They were white men. A lot of the reason it was documented and the spin on the documentation could be to frame people in bad lights. It could be to diminish work. It could be to raise up the work. And so when we think about the history of the movements, all of the movements, the continued history of these movements, we really need to acknowledge all of the people we see and everyone we don't. And one of the things that I really enjoyed doing with my internship with the archives at OSU was tracking down a particular woman. Her name was Dr. Sarah Kate Chan, and I got to research her and find out how involved and influential she was in the suffrage movements in Portland, Oregon. Oh my God, she was the head. I'm going to forget the name that I settled on for this organization because in the documentation, there were like 3 different names for the organization, but essentially it was a group of Chinese American women and their sort of suffrage league or voter league or whatever every newspaper decided to call it. And she was their leader, and her daughter was involved, and she won't come up on Wikipedia. Well, she might, depending on where my work is on in like Google searches, but she isn't somebody you can look up really. She's not someone there are very many pictures of. She has the same initials as her husband, so you can find him when you look her up. It took a lot of work to find out what her name was. It took a lot of work to acknowledge that she was a doctor of Chinese medicine and that is a valid medical practice, that she identified her work as being a mother, as being a wife, as being engaged in this, and that she acknowledged too that the work she was doing in Portland for the suffrage movement might not get her or her daughters the right to vote. And she was critical, very critical of the white women for this. And that work, a lot of that has been made invisible. There are interesting terminology when referring to Chinese women in the newspapers of the time. A lot of the newspapers, I would imagine, just aren't here. Nobody thought they were important enough to save. Even if it was printed, it was probably recycled or just thrown into the street somewhere. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that there's so much of it that we don't know. And when we look at the tiny little fragments of what we're trying to understand, we need to understand that they are fragments, that people made them, people with biases, people with opinions made them, and they made them for a purpose. And to try and read all of that into the work, I think, is really important. And it gives a different understanding and context to the entire suffrage movement and all of the work that happened then and now and continued to happen. When you really view it not just as fact that you can look at a newspaper article from the time and it is proof, but when you try and understand why someone wrote it that way, then it gives a different insight into what everything might have felt like, and allows us to acknowledge that what we are working with today is a partial image, and that we have biases and opinions and ideas that we are superimposing on top of that partial image. And it's important just to remember that. There's no way of getting around it. It is part of this process. And the challenge and the issue is when we don't acknowledge it. If we acknowledge it and we can look at this and deal with that, then, you know, we're being as honest with ourselves and each other and the whole history of us as possible. But if we pretend that it is factual information, that there are no biases, then we ignore bodies of knowledge, we ignore the invisibleness that was created then, and we end up losing all of this contextual information, all of these pieces and all of these stories that you can kind of read and find when you read between the lines. When you start to imagine and put yourself into that situation, who else needed to have been there to support something? You might hear one name and it was at an organization or at a dinner, and then you have to remember that there must have been other people there. And who were those people? What lives did they hold? How could they be there? And I think that that's really important when we do this sort of work and we look at historical objects and archives and all of that, is to remember why they were made, who made them, and what that says to us now. So that's my bit of the things that I think people should be aware of when you read about this movement.
Thank you, Avery. Can I ask a follow-up question about, you know, in today's world, how are we ensuring that we can carry forwards narratives forward that have less bias, or that are sharing the unsung heroes? What are your thoughts about, as an archivist, as a historian, you know, thinking about the living history today? What can we do today for those in our communities who are leaders and that we want to be documenting through their eyes?
No, that's a really good question. Honestly, the honest answer is that as just a member of my own few communities, I wouldn't know and be able to speak for others. I'm not in them. I don't know what sort of knowledge bases they have to give advice as to how to preserve them. I think for each community, they will have the understanding and depth to preserve their knowledge base. And there's always work people can do to share knowledge bases. But I wouldn't know what some of that activism is like and how to preserve it. In my work, I've seen everything from, like, I mean, full-on journalism, and then scrapbooks and pictures, and all of it's valuable, is what I would say. There's also an acknowledgement that has to happen of it might not ever be without bias, and it is impossible to save all of it, and that's okay. It is sad, but it is also okay. When we move forward, we just need to know that. We would become a world full of hoarders if we tried to save like every tiny scrap of every memory, and it would be impossible. I would say that in our day and time, it's really tricky. There are issues that I think are going to be really hard to identify until we look back on them. We're in it. We often, when we're in something, we think we're doing the best we can and that we've alleviated all bias possible. We think we're excelling at something, and then 20 years later, you look back and you see all the ways that you could have been different or improved. And you see all the ways that that has an impact on that time frame. And for us and our time, we've got Twitter. I don't even know what to do with Twitter. There's Facebook, there's Instagram. We've got so many like journalists, bloggers, online ways of distributing this, actual paper ways of distributing this. We've still got home footage. The ability to document ourselves has increased dramatically. And I think that it'll be an adventure for historians and archivists to figure out how to read into that material, figure out what to save, all of that. I would say that having learned from that, learned from our history, learned from our ancestors, just keeping a cultural memory alive within our own communities. And like the polling question, asking our family members what their experiences were, asking our friends what their experiences are, even if it doesn't translate into something that is concrete for a stranger to look at, keeps us as individuals engaged. It keeps us, it uses us essentially as our hard drive, our shared hard drive for our cultural memory and these stories. And it allows us to continue to learn from all of the people who came before us without necessarily being conscious of it. And I think that can be a challenge, is that we might not be conscious of it. But it's important nonetheless. And of course, documenting is always really important. Photographers can go out there and take these beautiful pictures, and maybe they end up in a shoebox for forever, but eventually somebody finds them, and then it can change the world. And I think to some degree that's just the nature of what happens. But you can always use multiple sources. Please, everyone, try to use as many sources as possible when they check things. I think that's one of the advantages that we have now, is that there is more documentation that can happen naturally. There are more cameras, there are more phones, there are more computers. But then there's a lot more to wade through sometimes too. There's a lot more fluff that can be put there, and you have to understand, in the case of something like Instagram, sometimes the bias can be even more. People are trying to show you a particular image, and you really have to be able to see that and read through that. But I think that it'll just be a learning process for all of us to understand how these things impact us, the best ways to document them, the best ways to save them. Approaching everything as honestly as you can, with as much integrity as you can, and trying your hardest to have an open mind to other phenomena and culture, so that you work the best to not impose your own ideas on what's happening, but also to acknowledge your position, your social location in society, and all of your identity pieces, to understand how you might be viewing something, and make sure that everyone knows that that's who you are, so that they know, they can guess how you might see something and why you did it your way, is really critical and really important, and is one of the things that you learn in a program like Women and Gender Studies, that you can't remove your own bias. And so to just make sure everybody's talking about it is key.
Thank you, Avery. Rachel, love to hear your thoughts.
Something I would want people to know, and I think that applies to today and how history impacts us today. And I think when we don't know our history, we do repeat it and we don't even realize we're doing it. And so it's really important for us to acknowledge what happens so that we can avoid doing those things again. And unfortunately, we're in this country, we're not very good about acknowledging history and things that, even when we're talking about the suffrage movement, and even marching, and the women's parade, I mean, just that one incident, that one example of Black women being made to go to the back. And how do we see that today, right? And so I want to make us aware that this is a pattern that not just happened in 1913, but it's a pattern that happens in 2020. It's a pattern that happened in 2016 with the White Women's March that started in January of 2016, 2017, 2018. And I think it's something that you notice. And when I say White Women's March, I don't think they call it that, but that's really what it was. And so I think, I think not just talking about history, but talking about today, right? And how we're finding ourselves in those same situations fighting for, what rights are we fighting for, and who deserves to be considered a part of that fight, right? So when we talk about the White Women's March of 2016, and millions of women are marching together, who gets centered in that story? And so when we talk about the women's suffrage movement, we're talking about white women getting centered. And when we talk about the White Women's March of 2016, who was centered in that story, who was made, and most locally was the Portland story of 2016, when the NAACP in Portland had to even pull out of that organization of that march because it was so problematic that white women wanted white women to be centered, right? And so we don't have to really go back too far to understand that we continue to repeat history. And I would say, let's stop that, right? When we talk about, well, how does that show up today? You may ask me, well, okay, that was 2016, but how does that show up in 2020? It shows up in ways that we continually, even as Lou brought up, of indigenous women, right? Already having this autonomy, this right to vote. And so, but this co-opting, right? This sort of co-opting of kind of like white women kind of taking on that, like, we're gonna do this, but not in the name of women of color, but in the name of white women. Does that make sense? And so how does that look like today in 2020 is that we saw that exact thing happen again recently in Portland with the Wall of Moms. And it unfortunately came to a head where one of the leaders decided, they wanted to do their own thing. And again, Black women were left to wonder, I thought this was about Black lives, but it became about everyone but us, right? And so again, I want people to look and say, how are we repeating the wrongs of the past? And not just how are they repeating it, how am I repeating the wrongs of the past? Because whenever I find myself doing something, I have to think, Angel, why are you doing that? Because when I realized that was a historical thing and it's a thing that keeps repeating itself, I have to say, why are you doing that? Because it's not okay, it's not right, but you keep finding yourself minimizing yourself, making yourself invisible because others make you invisible. And you have to say, wait a minute, I'm not gonna do that, right? And so what in 2020 have we learned from the past that we didn't really change? We've brought it with us as women, right? So now I'm talking to the women on the call. How do we, especially the white women, how do you, when you fight, right, when you stand up, how do you say, how do I stop minimizing women of color? How do I stop being the front person that thinks they know all the answers? How do we come together cross-culturally and fight together, right? Because honestly, it's rarely that it happens, because even when I've learned about the women's suffrage movement, guys, I have to honestly say, people have made it seem like just because we were together, that we were together, right? So just because you saw Ida B. Wells marching, not in the back, right? You would think, even though they were they were spitting, they were calling names in the crowd, you would think, but they all came together. And look at those Black women, right? They're marching in there, those 60 Black women. So we're all coming together because we're together. But guess what? Guess what we learned? Just because we're together doesn't mean we're together. And so how do we, moving forward from not waiting till 2021, I'm trying to figure out, y'all, how do we come together but also be together? Meaning, Jessica McDonald, as the president of League of Women Voters, how is Jessica using her privilege to leverage Angel Harris, president of the NAACP? And how am I using my privilege to leverage Jessica McDonald? because I don't have to throw her under the bus for us to get our rights. We actually can to leverage our privilege of being presidents to get us both. We get to both be advantaged because of that. Does that make sense? So moving forward, so we can talk about history like Avery talked about, right? It's a continual thing, right? We're saying today, because our kids and our kids' kids are gonna look back and be like, we may be on that screen, right? Our pictures, hopefully we will be doing some noteworthy things to make a difference. And so each one of us in this room, I want you to think about how can I be the one so that we're together and not just occupying space together, right? And so how can it make it so it's not just about me, but it's about the collective? Like, how do we do that? Because we have not, I don't think we've done that. And maybe Avery and Luhui can maybe I'm seeing something that, or not seeing something that you guys have already seen, but I don't know if we've ever been able to literally be together, where I'm fighting for my indigenous sisters, right? And where I'm fighting for my Asian sisters, right? And they're fighting for me, and I'm fighting for my white sisters, right? And we're fighting for each other, and we're not leaving each other behind because some of us are invisible. Yeah. Can we just do that?
Let's do that. Yeah. Angel, I want to hear responses to that. And I also want to make sure, because I know we're going towards the end, tell us about Delta Sigma Theta. I would love to know your connection to them.
Delta Sigma Theta. Okay, so Delta Sigma Theta, so obviously there were sororities, so kind of like the women organizations. We were not allowed as Black women to join white sororities. And so we have the Divine Nine, historically Black sororities and fraternities. And Delta Sigma Theta, so there's, I think there's 4 of sororities. And Delta Sigma Theta was the second founded sorority, Black sorority. And we're all about sisterhood. We're all about service. And we were out of Howard University, which is a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. And you probably heard of it because Biden's running mate is Howard. And also Kamala Harris is also AKA Alpha Kappa Alpha, which is the first Black historical sorority. And so she is an AKA actually. So we are very proud of her. Delta Sigma Theta has thousands and thousands of members across the United States. And so when you think about our organization, sometimes people can recognize who we are because we just, I don't know, I don't want to brag y'all, but we just hold ourselves differently. And so that's why when I talk about who was a part of the suffrage movement, and I say it wasn't just those 22 founders, but I.G. Wells, who ended up being a Delta, Mary Terrell Churchill, also Delta, right? It's just that small example will tell you the caliber of woman that we are. We have a chapter, so we have an alumni and an undergrad chapter out of Portland, Beta Psi chapter. And so, yeah, my sophomore year, I took the plunge, and yeah, it's weird. It's like, it's opened so many doors for me. And again, it's like people can recognize you. It's kind of interesting. So Luhui knows about this because she's in sorority too. But yeah, it's not the traditional, I'm not into like the party stuff or anything like that. but I'm really into service to our community, service to the community, and Delta Sigma Theta sorority does that very well. So keep your eyes out for us and Google us. And just really also quickly, we don't discriminate based on race. So we also have members who aren't Black, right? So we are historically Black sorority, but I want to make sure that people know the way that we were treated, which we couldn't get into white sororities, we don't do that as a sorority. We don't really do that as a people, right? Because we know how it feels to be excluded. So one of my line sisters, Shannon Brown, she's actually indigenous. She's biracial, indigenous, and white. And so so I just wanted to put that out there to make sure you just didn't think it was that we discriminate or anything. So go Deltas.
Go Deltas. So I would love to hear, as we come to the end, I think Angel, you queued that up so well about thinking about where we are in 2020 and, you know, what are we facing today? Thoughts, departing thoughts for, you know, the participants and people that will be listening to this afterwards about what you want people to know about the ripple effect and also what is very actively happening today in voter suppression, but also what can we do about it? So if you have, I know you have thoughts on that. There's not an if you have thoughts on that, you have thoughts on that. I know, and so I'd love to hear from you. Whoever would like to go next.
I'll say something about that really quick. Definitely people need to vote. Like, I don't think that should be not a thing anymore. But I don't think it should end there, right? Like, people are like, I voted, so the work is done. Like, there's so much work to do beyond just voting. And so, like, understanding the reasons why certain people are asking for policy changes and understanding, like, the work that needs to be done to meet those needs. So, for example, in Oregon, Representatives Tana Sanchez passed House Bill 2625 last year. And that was, well, she didn't pass it, she introduced it and it was passed. And that was to create a task force, an interjurisdictional task force to work on murdered and missing Indigenous women's issues here in the state of Oregon. And there's federal policy changes coming up too that people have been asking for, or understanding what the Violence Against Women Act is and like why that even needs to be reauthorized is beyond me. Like, why does that have to be reauthorized every so many years? Like, little things like that, being aware of what kind of policies are coming up at a federal and local level, what's happening in your local city. I know not everybody's from Corvallis, but like what's going on in Corvallis, like what's going on with the bias response report stuff, what's going on with the recent changes with the schools. And so it's like, what's happening locally that you can be involved with, what's happening at a state level, what's happening nationally, but not just knowing what they are. How can you be actively involved? How can you be a part of these changes, because they impact all of us. And like I said before, like, people may not like the systems in place and have thoughts about that. I know I have my thoughts about it, but there are changes happening that impact us. Some are good and some are really bad. So thinking about like voter suppression in certain states. So like in South Dakota, when they were trying to pass, or they did pass that bill that you had to have a physical address in order to vote, impacted tribal communities because they don't have necessarily street addresses. And so they don't have a street address, they can't register to vote. And that took out how many tribal people's political voice. So the tribe ended up issuing street addresses for everybody, which was amazing because they're like, nice try. It's like 2019, we know what we can do now. And so that's kind of some examples of like, there's still efforts to try to silence the political voice of communities. There's things that are passed that attack people's bodies, specifically like trans people's bodies, to exclude them from healthcare or to exclude them from medical treatment. And those are really real things that happen now. And that's because of who's voted in. And those people that are voted in are the ones who make those rules and make those laws that impact people in very real ways. And so I really encourage people to learn more about what's important to people on the ballot, like read more about them, but not just stop there, like get involved locally or nationally. If you don't know how to be involved, there's probably plenty of people that can help you, point you in the right direction. Or even if you don't have time to be involved, just staying updated about things and know how certain things are going to be impacting your local communities and beyond.
Great.
I would add to just some basic ones. You know, there's no voting holiday. People have to take time off of work to find a polling place to go vote. And that is suppression. That, you know, it's not equally accessible for everyone to just cast the vote, because sometimes you have to find, you couldn't leave your children, you couldn't leave your job. That's not equal, that's not okay, that's not fair. And so doing everything in our power to just get a voting holiday, that's a big deal. Or to change how the votes are cast. Mail-in ballots, as like an Oregonian, that's really awesome. That's not something, you know, everyone gets. There's been so much controversy over that, so much effort to suppress that as a process that could happen in the pandemic. But, you know, to really learn about ways to make it accessible to actually do the act of voting is a big first step. And I think that there's lots of work that can be done on it. You can learn how to do it. You can ask people about it. You can just have conversations about it in your own communities. You can learn and read, and then you can start to ask your representatives to do the thing that you want them to do. And that's really powerful, to ask your representatives to implement what you want to see. But that's what I would say is, like, it's a really good starting place too, is just to get it so we can all, to the best of our ability, just like not have to take off work to go vote. That's a big hindrance to so many Americans.
Jill, did you have any final thoughts? I know you already shared some thoughts about 2020. I also think that, just interestingly, Avery, as you bring up vote by mail and thinking about our history with the League of Women Voters, I wanted to share something. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so in 1998, I was 19 years old. I was taking part in November in my first major election, and this ballot measure was one that I voted on. If you were here in Oregon voting in 1998, you did as well. And this is the ballot measure that moved Oregon exclusively to vote by mail, becoming the first state in the US to do so. And I want to say, if you look down on that ballot and you look at who the two chief petitioners are, one of those is named Paula Crane. She is a board member of the League of Women Voters of Corvallis. She might be on this call. She lives here in Corvallis. And she was the president of the League of Women Voters of Oregon at that point in time. The League was the chief petitioner here to be able to move to vote by mail. And I think those stories, I think as Avery, as you were talking about, what gets written down, what gets archived, what gets recorded, how are we passing stories forward? This is a local one. This is a good one to know. Your local story of how here in Corvallis, two people on this list are from Corvallis that helped move vote by mail forward and becoming one of that and with motor voter registration, two of the reasons why Oregon is at the top of the heap of voter rights. I just thought that that's a wonderful thing to share. And then I want to leave us also, I'm going to put into the chat box a resource list that the panelists have reviewed. We've put together books, articles, videos, some really great videos, one on the Delta sorority that I put on there this afternoon. And also just thinking about how to get involved. I think the number one thing, if you went away from here and you read just a couple of additional articles, and then you went and talked to some family members and friends, and you asked about their voting stories, that in and of itself would be success to me. That in and of itself would be great. But if you're wanting to go the next step further, here are some organizations that are working directly with voter suppression and voter rights right now. And vote411.org at the bottom there is a website I added on that the League manages and put together that is a one-stop shopping for all information voting related. So you can meet your candidates, you can understand their platforms, and it is a great central location that has been a great resource for me. So I want to stop sharing here, and then I'm going to put into the chat box the PDF of reading resources. And if you have any questions, we'll have a few minutes, and I would encourage you to add your question to the chat box if you have something for the panelists. I'll wait a second here as somebody might be typing in. And we've had many, I will say, for the panelists here, many messages of just thanks and appreciation for your stories and your experience, your sharing of history. And I'm going to put this PDF here into the chat, and it should be there now. So I know that we're just at an hour and a half over. I want to say thank you so much to our panelists for being here this evening, for the ongoing education and struggle to both understand our history and also understand how it impacts us today and what we can do. As Lou said, not only getting involved locally, but really knowing what's going on, really understanding, getting informed. Some of the themes that I feel like I'm taking away today are, the systems that are not always built for us, but able to work through and struggle against. And you might not see that result in your lifetime. And as Angel said, people have built this for us. People have struggled for you. And so our responsibility to move this forward. I also am inspired by hearing about the stories as I put those photos together. This rang too with Avery and Angel talking about universities and colleges and the next generation. How are we engaging the next generation in this work? How are we bridging the stories that we're all hearing here today with our children and grandchildren and carrying this forward? And with that, I just want to say how much I appreciate the three of you, how honored I am to be here with you, and I look forward to continued conversations. Thank you very much. And good night. And if anybody has a question as follow-up, you can always contact us through the League of Women Voters website, and we should have this recording up next week as well, and please share with your friends and family. Have a good evening.